All right, it's 2 after now. I'll get started. Let's see. So what you see on your screen is the join code for the Nearpod that'll be running the presentation through, mainly because it allows anonymized long form or short, medium form feedback from participants. So you should all be able to see the code in front of you. And I'm just going to leave, let's say, 2 minutes for people to get the code or to look at the code and turn it into that, type it into that website there. So the website is at the top of this box that says join at Nearpod, join.nearpod.com. So if you go to that website or open your app, your Nearpod app, and put this code, you should be able to copy and paste it pretty easily. That'll get you into the presentation. You'll be able to participate in all the questions, contribute to all the conversations. I would say just if you're joining us, please remember to mute yourself upon entry. Tish will be monitoring the chat. So if you put any questions in there, she should be able to see them. I'll take questions as we go happily. And then there will be spaces for typed questions that'll be anonymized from the audience. But I'll run through that as we get to it. So once again, please follow the instructions on the screen. Go to join.nearpod.com as it says, and put in the code that you see in the big giant letters on the screen. You should be able to use the little icon just to the right of the code to copy it and then paste it into your app or the website. Okay, we'll give another minute for people to get into the website. Windy today.
Yes, I don't like the creakiness.
The creakies from the wind.
It freaks me out.
Okay. All right, we're now at 12:05, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. But if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll be going through how to do that in Zoom in a second. All right, I'm going to take the code down, but if you need it any time, it'll be at the top of the screen. All right. So welcome. Thanks for coming to Equity, not just for houses anymore. Let me move ahead. Happy Pi Day. For those of you that don't know, Pi Day celebrates the ever expanding number pi. What is the, Tish, do you remember what is pi again? It's the ratio of the diameter of a circle to the number of times it.
It's 22 sevenths. That's what it is.
22 sevenths. It's. Does anybody in the chat or in the building know, in the meeting know? I think it's the ratio, the number of times that the diameter of a circle goes into its circumference. Is that correct? Do we have math faculty with us?
Pi r squared is the diameter.
Pi r squared is the circumference, I think.
Is that the circumference?
Pretty sure. It's been a long time.
Ooh.
Do we see any?
Dr. Cullen says yes. You are correct.
Fantastic. I
Thank
remember something. Okay, well, happy Pi Day because it's March 14th. You get it. Okay. All right, next. Let's see. All right, so before I do this slide, I'm going to do this slide just because I think that it works better this way. So what I'd like you to do, assuming everybody can see the slide currently up in Nearpod, what I'd like you to do, I'd like everybody to try to raise their hand using Zoom. All right, Jackie's got it, Tish has got it. If anyone doesn't know how to do this, please put it in the chat. Somebody's clapping. I see lots of people know how to do this. All right. Okay, so from let's see, let me get to my page on this. There we go. All right. So this is a kind of a demonstration of an equity-focused move within teaching. So the problem so there's a crucial difference. I love how many of these hands I'm seeing. The crucial difference between the clapping emoji or the thumbs up and the raise hand emoji. They should all be accessible from the same place within Zoom or very near each other. The difference with the raise hand emoji is that automatically moves you into the part of the attendance sort of video screen roster that you see, right? You sign in, you see a bunch of blank, squares with your students' names on them. If you raise your hand, Zoom automatically moves your little square with your name on it or your face in it into the top right-hand corner of that. It automatically puts focus on it. So that way you draw the instructors or the meeting leader's attention without having to break in using your mic, which is something that would be pretty hard. I mean, probably most of us would be able to get ourselves to do that, but if you think about our students, a lot of them are very shy, a lot of them hesitate to put themselves forward. There's all kinds of implications in this from gender studies, for instance. And so this is one way of removing it's a small barrier, but it's a way of removing a barrier in the name of equity. I see, guessing if everybody will just play along and give me a thumbs up now. I'm assuming if you know how to do the raise hand, you can do the thumbs up. We'll just do that quickly. Perfect. Thank you. And then if you want to throw a disagree in there, that would be great, just to make sure we all know how to do this. Let's make sure we have the disagree.
It is. Because I did it.
You did it. All right. Okay. I see the disagrees pop up. All right. Now I'm assuming if you know how to do disagree, you saw the agree. So again, not things that necessarily address the biggest barrier to equity in the classroom, but useful tools. And now everybody knows how to do that. And probably the most crucial one is the raise hand button, just because of the way it brings you to the attention of the meeting leader or instructor in that case. All right, Bruce, do you actually have a question?
No, not at all. I was just playing along.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. All right, so you can lower your own hand. Everybody, you can lower your own hands, or the instructor can lower them for you. Either way, I often use that because, I'm popping my hand up as soon as I think of something, and then somebody else has asked the question or the instructor has answered it because I was being impatient, and then, all right. So just to confirm, Kim Madsen, you have a question, or have you just not put your hand down?
I'm just playing.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm going to lower your hand if you don't mind. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So thank you for coming along with me on that. Just an example, early on checks to make sure every student in the class has the maximum number of ways of participating in the class. What you want to do is make sure, as much as is within your control as an instructor, every student has the same ability to interact with the class. And really what you're going for if we're talking about equity is every student feels the same amount of comfort interacting with the class. Again, that's something that we don't have full control over, but we can get closer to it. All right, so let me come back here. All right, Pi Day, talked about it, we're good? Okay. So here's a question I'd like you to answer in the Nearpod. You should be able to access it. If you have questions, raise your hands or get my attention otherwise. I'd like you to, and these are anonymous from the room, right? So I later will be able to see what these are, but I won't, like no one else in this meeting will be able to see what you answer here, just so you know. I'd like you to mention something that affects your work, your teaching, or your studying that you can't control. This is a major question when we're talking about equity and trying to build it into classrooms. So I'm going to watch I'm not setting a predetermined time limit, but I will be watching to see as the answers populate. I try not to let it go on for too long. All right, I see chronic illness, right? This is a really significant one, and it can be unpredictable too. All right, amount of sleep we get. Well, you've eaten. It's like financial insecurity, all of that. Car breaking down, that's another good one too, and tied to financial insecurity. Let's see. Right, distractions, yeah. And that's something that as instructors, we have it kind of in our wheelhouse to try to deal with in the classroom, but not necessarily when students are doing their homework or otherwise. Family situations, illness, life hurdles, anxiety, right? Especially given some challenges with attaining, getting access to medical or especially mental health care in the region. Again, not all of our students are on campus. At least technology for sure. Loud noises, yeah. Okay, so they should be able to see all of these, right? Okay. All right, so I'm going to do this a couple of times. It's something I used when I was teaching, but I'll give you the less structured version of it since I'm going to assume that you're all, well, I shouldn't assume, but I will. I'm going to ask you the less structured question. If it doesn't help, I'll add some structure. But so I'd ask you to take a look at these answers and see if you can identify any patterns within these. Now, I was talking on as we went a little bit, but I'm sure you guys can pick some stuff out. What kind of patterns do you see in these events or situations that affect the members of this group without their ability to control them, but which do affect their work? Please feel free to just jump in, unmute yourself, or put it in the chat, and Tish will read it out.
So Joanne Hayes added her answer was weather.
Weather, yeah, especially out here this time of year. Anybody noticing any patterns, anything in common between these different events or situations?
Brittany says all are stressful. These
Yes.
are all unknowns and unable to control.
Definitely. Level of stress, which in itself can become a complicating factor. Thank you, Brittany.
Disruptions to routine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Disruptions, again, causing a knock-on effect of stress, which can make the impact of other events, more distracting, more disruptive. All right. Okay, so a common pattern of stress, definitely. Especially because the question itself asks about work, teaching, or studying, all things that carry performance implications. So your work is disrupted, or your teaching is disrupted, which may be your work, or your studying is disrupted. You stand to pay a kind of penalty for that. And for anything that causes you to pay a penalty that's not a result of your own controllable actions is going to be something that as instructors we want to think about when we're looking to improve equity within our classrooms and our setups. So this is just an example of some of the kind of things that we're experiencing them. Certainly it's common sense that our students are going to be experiencing them too. All right, so just to warm up. Okay, so here's the Raptor. Okay, I'll explain the Raptor. So thank you for coming. I appreciate everybody, joining us. Let me address the dinosaur in the room or on the screen. This 3D resource was a part of the slide pack that I used in PowerPoint initially, and I just thought it was fun as I was building the presentation. It actually has a thematic relevance though, so it may be a little tiny bit of a stretch, but I'm going to unpack it. So none of us want to live in a world where our starting resources or our current uncontrollable resources are the difference between success and dinosaur-induced death, right? The raptor lives in that world. If the raptor was born with one leg shorter than another, the raptor is not going to live very long. We are subject to situations like that as humans as well. We use society and the social contract, such as it is, to try to mitigate some of those things, but I think many people would agree that there are ways that we can do that better and ways that we can strengthen the social contract within our own classrooms. And that's what this sort of webinar will be about. So one other sort of preliminary thing. I've only just stepped into the field of instructional design formally in a way that engages with theory and background knowledge. Prior to this semester, as some of you know, I was an instructor here and in many other places. I have about 10 years, maybe 11 years of experience in that field. The reason I introduced that is that I'm hoping that if I make any claims or mention any facts in this webinar that are not cited and you'd like to have a source for that information, that you won't hesitate to ask me. I mentioned my relative newness to this field just because I'm not going to be doing it perfectly right away, and I just ask that rather than sit silently and wonder where the information came from, you let me know so that I can supply it to you, because that is now a significant component of my job. So I see my job, as I mentioned it, as a supporting resource for faculty and staff in the maintenance of good evidence-based instructional practices. As a former faculty, like many of us who clawed my way through a doctoral program, I know that very few of us came to our teaching with any training in teaching. We developed our skills and knowledge on the fly, working through failure to find methods that worked for our students and ourselves. The field of learning science has moved a lot just in the last few decades and continues to accelerate as resources are poured into it. I am convinced that it is now more than can be fairly expected of faculty, given the already bracing demands of these positions in teaching, service, and scholarship, to maintain currency in an additional field of study without support from professionals focused on that field specifically and specifically tasked with such support. So that's how I understand my position here at CSC. Well, that's a main component. I think Tish and I both feel that we're here for staff as well and students, but it's a significant component of our work here to support faculty in evidence-based teaching practices. Our system of teaching in colleges writ large, right beyond CSC, has its roots in some fine traditions of the mind and body, but its teaching roots are in elite education for elite individuals who had wealth and family station supporting them. Many of these individuals still, if we think back to the early days, like I think back to Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, and her writing about, Frankenstein living and getting sick and not eating enough, right? So still someone coming from a very privileged position, though. I don't know, his dad was a duke or something. He had a family castle. Many of them failed despite that privilege, right? Frankenstein nearly fails. We now have a profoundly different group of students who interact with the world much closer to the bone in terms of resources and support from others as I'm not sure if it's a majority yet, but it's a growing, nearly majority minority at this point in higher education. To lighten the mood while maintaining the point, the Raptor is nipping at our students' heels. This is something we have to adjust to if we want to maintain our relevancy and if we want to be able to bring what we bring to students beyond just financially relevant credentials to them, right? I think none of us wants to think that only the wealthy should have access to the resources that we represent in terms of our expertise and teaching skill. All right, so here's Zoom equity. We did this. If there are any questions going forward, please let me know. Also, and especially if you've joined the Zoom meeting since the beginning and you can't find the Nearpod joining code and website, we will put it in the chat. We'll build that into our practice going forward. Okay, all right. So another question. This one, since obviously the slide deck is already created, there's only so much I can do about this question, but I would like to know, what do you, the joined members here, need for this seminar, webinar thing to be useful for you in your teaching practice? Many things you say maybe, don't hesitate to add something that I clearly can't do right now because I'll use it going forward. But I would like to know. I'll try to keep this one relatively short. But practical suggestions I see already popping in. Thank you. Concrete examples, good. We have concrete examples. Real strategies, I think we have that. And we have some interaction, so hopefully it satisfies.
Relevant content of courses.
Relevant content of courses. Interesting. I would ask if you're the person that added the relevant content of courses comment in here, if you could expand upon that if you're comfortable. Just unmuting yourself and joining us with your voice, that would be great.
Or send it in the chat.
Or put it in the chat, that's always good too.
How can we use these concepts in our classrooms and online in an immediate way?
Immediate way, okay, good. That will be a little bit more of a challenge, but is also certainly something that you could bring to the TLPC, even midstream. I'm sure that we would be able to sit down and find ways to integrate it on the fly. Okay. All right, so because I don't want to spend too much time here, I want to get to the content that you all are asking for. I'll just say if I was going to ask what patterns we see and I was a member of the audience, I'd say I see a lot of call for practical strategies, which I think I'm offering, but I'm certainly not offering as much as we can provide. So please stay tuned. All right. Any final comments or questions before I move on? Anybody want to add to this? All right, okay, moving on. But it's good to know. Thank you for your input. All right. I want to talk about something that is going to form the basis for a lot of what I'm talking about today, or the sort of philosophical background. And that's the idea of learner-centered instruction. Very similar, but not identical to the idea of student-centered instruction. I heard this a lot as a faculty member, and I think when I went to create this slide, I learned more that I thought would have been useful. So let me talk first about what it does not mean. Learner-centered teaching does not mean that students are indulged and that faculty are deprofessionalized and made into customer service agents for the college, right? This is the sort of darkest, most fearful interpretation of this word that I ever felt, in my bones as a faculty member when I heard about it. There was a reason why I thought that, contextual reasons, reasons of the particular environment I was in, but that's not what we are talking about in TLPC, or certainly not what I'm talking about here. So this kind of representation is out there in the world in which we must acknowledge it. Some institutions have decided that financial exigencies justify minimizing tenure-track faculty in favor of adjuncts, for instance, treating students as customers who have purchased a degree certificate 4 years down the line, for instance. These are things that we see in the world as professionals, and we don't want them at our institution. So let me reiterate, that is not what TLPC or I am talking about. They're not even really, these methods of doing quote unquote learner-centered teaching are not really even compatible with student-centered or learner-centered teaching in essence, since they degrade the status of both students and faculty, right? And they reduce the focus on learning, and they reduce the focus on the academy as a place of generating knowledge. What we're advocating for at TLPC, what I'm advocating for in this instance, is for a rebalance of the relationships within the classroom in the direction of students. This is in response to much older traditions in post-secondary education that predate the broadening of the community of learners in the mid to late decades of the 20th century, and certainly the broadening of the community that happened in the 90s with the increased access to financial aid options, which brought a massive influx of low-income students into the higher education system. The old sage on the stage techniques, which originated at schools designed to train clergy, in the majority of clergy and military leaders. And I don't even know that those techniques are relevant to most clergy these days. These techniques prioritize lecture and passively listening students at the most taking notes. They're rooted in the elite educational models I mentioned before, and these sort of we can see these in the dawn of the American university system, particularly the Ivy Leagues. And these are designed without much consideration for student situation. And before the advent of empirical studies into human learning meant we actually could know what actually works for most students. These are called teacher-centered techniques, although I think that's an unfortunate choice of words since, as I mentioned before, I do think that they make us less teachers than we could be. These work reliably only for the most privileged and externally supported students. This is what the data tells us. The lucky few, as it were. Our demographics at CSC are not characterized by an abundance of these students. And so I think we need to move away from this kind of technique. Although I say that, I want to make it clear that I don't think that most people here use these techniques, but this is what we're moving away from, and we can move farther than we are at. I certainly could, for instance, improve this presentation from this regard. All right, so a quick look at the contextual situation outside of CSC. All right. So you can see here a quote from a recent study of first-generation low-income students and what is being done to support them. The full quote is worth reading, I think, despite the fact that it's not best practices with PowerPoint slides. It reads, "It is increasingly clear that many FGLI students, that is first-generation low-income students, require additional guidance in navigating the wilderness that is their first college experience. New research by the Pell Institute for the Study of Opportunity in Education and the University of Pennsylvania shows that FGLI students generally struggle in meeting academic standards, gaining a sense of belonging, and acquiring the skills necessary for life both during and after college. And despite lip service to the contrary, as well as some honest efforts, higher education institutions in general simply aren't adequately sensitive to FGLI students' needs or doing enough to retain them and help them succeed. Data from the Pell Institute reveal that only 11% of students nationally who identify as both first generation and low income graduate with a bachelor's degree within 6 years of matriculation. So 11% within 6 years. I mean, that's just a huge failure of our national system. I do have good news for you there. It seems that given the numbers that Strive Trio are looking at and generating for their upcoming grant applications, it does seem like Chadron State College is doing better than that 11%, and quite a bit. I wasn't able to get those numbers in time to really incorporate them in here, but the number of FGLI students has increased dramatically since the 1990s when student aid became more available. And this is one reason for the increased urgency of calls to support them and the increased direction of funding towards equity initiatives and student support services initiatives in campuses across the country.
And Tel says that she thinks TRIO has a graduation rate of around 89 to 92%.
Awesome. So just remember that. That's how much better our Strive TRIO student support services and the rest of our student support services are doing than the national average. So there's a lot to be proud of there. Some of the best students I ever had were FGLI students, and their success meant a huge amount to me because I knew what they were striving against. But that takes work. All right. Okay. Oh, you can also see, well, I would use the laser pointer, but you can't see it. Right at the bottom, you have a short version of their recommendations. And they're all, except for the last one, perhaps, well within our capacity to organize and support. I mean, we can certainly advocate for more funding for these programs, but it's a rather more complicated situation. All right. So here are some statistics from Chadron State College specifically. The thing to remember here, this is our Pell Grant data. Pell Grant students, although this is an area that's expanding, but Pell Grant students represent, according to the federal government, an exceptional level of need. And what you see here is data based on IPED statistics from 2013, 2014 entering classes, or the time of those entering classes. And what I'd like to direct your attention to, if you can read it, it's a little tiny, I know, is that the large, most translucent box represents the total entering class for 2013, 2014. The middle box represents the 2013, 2014 entering recipients of Pell Grants, right? So you can see it's just under half of the total entering class. And then you can see that same number of entering Pell Grant recipients from the prior year. It's not the best order, I acknowledge that, but you can see we had more in the 2013-2014 year than we did in the 2013-2012 year. So we, and 2013-2014 is about, Pell Grants are about just under half of our total student body. So these are students, again, let's see, it's, sorry?
They have an exceptional.
They have an exceptional need, yeah. So college, the idea, and this is where I'm going to go from here, is what these data say is that our usual sort of pre-1990s, pre-GI Bill, traditional sense of what college ready means is going to have to be flexible and change. Because the idea of college ready student is one which we expect students to meet certain standards of knowledge and learning within the hidden curriculum, which we addressed in our last webinar, of post-secondary education before they get to our classrooms. Now, the fact that we're dealing with more and more students with exceptional need means that that is going to be less and less the case with our student body. It's strongly linked, sort of that ability of, that innate incoming ability to deal with all these expectations is strongly linked to the expectations and demographics of elite institutions with high costs. So the idea of college ready is primarily based on the demographics of elite institutions with a high cost of attendance, low acceptance rates, and that serve primarily wealthy students from resource abundant homes. Given the predominance of first generation students and students from low income homes and working class agricultural roots, especially here, particularly those who do not grow up with abundant wealth and with hardworking parents who have to make a real effort to support their kids' education. Many of them do, of course. This model is not exactly suited to CSC. So when we think college ready, we need to be broadening the definition of what that means. And in doing so, we need to increase the amount of effort we're putting into efforts like equity.
So what I'm hearing is that instead of thinking of college ready as students who go to Harvard,
right,
we need to think of them as the students who come in here.
Exactly. We need to base when we think about whether a student is ready to meet the expectations in our courses, what I'm suggesting is that we base that on the data that we have on the students that are actually coming to CSC, as opposed to a theoretical idea of students that's largely rooted in the history and demographics of other institutions. So looking at what we have now, and that's why I'm going to spend some time looking at these statistics, because this is who we have now. All right. Another slide of data. In this case, again, I'll describe the boxes to you. The sort of lighter colored box is the percentage of first generation students entering CSC in the fall of 2019. And then you'll see the darker colored box is the total percentage of first generation students enrolled in the fall of 2019. So we had 34.2% of our students, first generation students, first person in their family, in their immediate family to go to college. And then in that same year, we had a class enter that was 41.9% folks coming from homes where they had no higher education degrees. So let me talk a little bit about what this means. You can see on the right of this page some characteristic experiences of groups that are first generation and low income, which is a significant minority of our students here, just under 50%. Each of these is something that, you know, I can get you information on if you would like, but we're not supposed to read off the slides. That's how it goes. So given that we have a significant portion of each entering class and a significant portion of the student body at any given time in the category of first generation students, it behooves us to adjust to that. And we need to think about the fact that struggles that are mentioned, like on the right of this slide here, are inflicted with the experience of low economic resources in their personal history. So these are things that they cannot control. You can't go back in time and change the conditions that develop the early parts of your personal history in high school, et cetera. An example of this first category, less exposure to the hidden curriculum, is something that, you know, this hidden curriculum that Tish mentioned in our previous webinar, right? One of the classic examples here, although I know it's frustrating to get these text message formatted emails from students, right? If you don't have a family history that is going to expose you to the idea that that's not a correct way to communicate in a formal educational environment, if your middle school didn't take pains to teach that, or your teachers weren't able to effectively deliver it, even if they tried, that's not something that's necessarily within a student's control. If we want to expect that, we have to teach it here. So if a student, for instance, another example, students working a full-time job or living in crowded or uncomfortable conditions, because those are the ones that they can afford, time to work under favorable physical, spatial, and resting conditions will not be easy to come by, right? Not everybody has their own computer where they live. Not everybody has a quiet space free from family members or maybe less committed students in which to find focus. Not everybody has a car that they can use to drive to campus. Our off-campus students are especially prone to being impacted by these situations because they don't have access to the resources that we provide to them. Many students live off campus as a way to cut their budget because there's an abundance of really cheap rentals in Chadron. And those of us that are new, that have signed on and maybe rented within the last couple of years know that not all of those accommodations really provide the level of rest, comfort, and defense from the elements, especially during the winter, that we would expect that would be conducive to sitting and studying for long periods of time. So it's not that study shouldn't be encouraged or taught, right? But we need to account for the fact that it may not be something that our students can immediately access. Students, especially those from working class backgrounds, in addition to all of these material conditions, often experience extreme guilt at the idea that they get to pursue their dreams of more rewarding work while their parents and relatives left behind, as it were, do not. This can motivate behavior that seems self-destructive from an outside perspective. And what I would focus on there specifically is taking student loan money and instead of using it for education, sending it home, which we have a lot of anecdotal evidence happens quite consistently, especially among our low-income first-generation students here. And I can get you more information on that if you'd like. Speaking to Strive Trio was extremely helpful for this presentation. All right, so I mean, we can think that they have they have student loans, but most of that money may not be staying with them. All right. So another question. What reflections of these conditions, the ones I just mentioned, and that appear on this slide, do you observe in your courses? Or do you observe behaviors that you think might be able to be linked to this? And if you could provide specific examples, that would be great.
And if you're staff, what do you see?
Yes, thank
in
you.
your interactions with students?
Yes. And remember also, all of those conditions and reactions that we looked at and we linked to stress in the early parts of this presentation fall within this. So think about that. Okay. All right, here you go. As always, your names are, let's see, hidden from the rest of the audience. So please take a minute and just provide an example or an illustrating fact or anything like that. Or a question, honestly, in response to these, that'd be fine. Yeah, students very rarely turn down free food. I think we do get some good free food here, but yeah, it takes effort to walk across campus. We know that none of us like to do that if we don't need to. Yes. Yes. The connect codes in the second 8 weeks is something that I'll be talking about later on, or I'll be mentioning relevant ideas. But yeah, that's one that I got straight from Strive Trio, that challenge. Yep, to be able to go home and visit family, especially if you think about that one. Well, let me stop talking so much so you can answer.
Students who hold jobs are more frequently tardy with assignments.
Absolutely. Yeah, excuse me if I'm not using this in the best way. I'm still getting used to Nearpod. All right. All right, I'm going to keep it moving, but if I move on before you're ready, please feel free to throw your suggestion into the chat. Once again, Tish is keeping an eye on it. I'm going to mention specifically before I do that, though, whoever mentioned students needing additional financial aid to go home more often to visit family. I want to draw a connection back to the previous slide where I mentioned the sense of incredible guilt that some first-generation students feel, especially from working class or agricultural homes, about the work that's being done and the way that people are having to compensate for their absence when they come to college, even if, and this is something that, let's see, if you check out this resource, FAM, towards the bottom, that you can find that that's the initial word in one of the bibliographic entries at the end of this. So you can find in FAM, they talk about breakaway guilt and this specifically difficult, highly motivating to return home and leave studies behind phenomenon. All right. So given all this potential inequity, right, if we can agree that the material circumstances students come from is largely not within their control, although partially, and the fact that they can take jobs is part of their way to address that, then we have to start thinking about equity if we want all things to be equal in the classroom. And what you see on the slide in front of you is, I used to be a big Oxford English Dictionary guy, but now that it's kind of behind a paywall, I started looking for alternatives, and I think Merriam-Webster does a pretty good job, although they don't have as much of the etymology, thank you, as I'd like. But so taking a look at this, and I'll ask you a question in a second. Let me just make clear, if it hasn't become clear already, that equity in contemporary non-financial usage, and this is the joke in our advertising material, equity in contemporary non-financial usage generally denotes an approach to justice, fairness, etc., that favors equality in outcomes rather than equality in applied resources, right? So in this context in which we're talking about, in the classroom, it's the idea that you want your students all to have a relatively similar ability to interact with the course material and learn from it, rather than thinking to yourself, well, I gave them all the same book, right? So they should be able to reach the same outcomes if they have the grit or personal character or whatever. We want to think about the fact that even though they may have the same input, the same book, or same access codes, right, there may be very consequential differences in their ability to learn from that material, to do assignments, and to get good grades. And we should, right, again, we can't erase those circumstances, but we can work to improve our classes a little bit at a time, maybe even on the fly in that respect. All right, so. All right, so I'm going to skip over the question about the use of the word, just because I'd like to get to this next slide, or this next question. So, what does equity look like to you at work, given this definition? And this is a broad question, I know, but I'd like you to answer, if you can, about what it looks like in terms of teaching, about what it looks like in terms of you doing your job, right, with your own limitations, about what it looks like in terms of your judgment of your students, perhaps. But I mean, when we talk about teaching, I think we should open the question to both your ability, say, to get papers graded in a timely manner, or your ability to show up every day, as well as your judgment of your students' ability to do that. So here we go. So what does equity look like to you at work? What's your experience of equity in your role here at CSC? And this could be examples of inequitous situations that you faced, or resources that you find particularly valuable in terms of addressing differences in resources, or neurodivergence, or physical capability. Things we're doing well, things that are not working. The ability to ask for help is huge. Yeah, especially, and this is something that touches students as well as faculty, staff. Every single level of the campus needs to be able to have this access. Not everybody is comfortable doing that, which is part of the reason why I went through the whole raise handy thing.
So someone in the chat said mass individual customization akin to an IEP for every student, which
Right.
takes into account an individual's need to be successful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And as someone who's taught high school, I can tell you the IEPs sometimes felt like an iniquitous demand on my time as a teacher, especially as a first year teacher. But you know, they're designed to address that in other students. It is important to TLPC that we find ways to address this that do not end up causing more problems for faculty than they solve in students. Or ideally, we find ways to do it, you know, with our help, us offering help, that nobody is really unduly burdened by these changes. Because we know that faculty have a limited amount of resources as well. Academic accommodations for students. Accommodations often involve doctors' verification, which can be challenging here. Opportunities, Jamboard has notes. Yes, I love Jamboard. I'm not using it here, but I think Jamboard is fantastic. Let's see. Academic and open communication. And I think it's worth coming back to the one that was first placed. All right. So good. Do we see any patterns in these answers? Does anybody notice anything besides what I'm drawing on about? Yep. We'll talk a little bit about documentation and specifically in the form of doctor's notes in a minute. But yeah, keeping that even is certainly an equity concern. All right.
But being willing to make exceptions if there are extenuating circumstances, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes back to if we go back, let's see. Well, I'll find a better way to go back to it. But the previous slide, when we talked about, let's see, completely fine. Okay. Oh, yes. Oh, I see. Okay. For anybody that's still not in the Nearpod and would like to be, I'll just throw that up for a minute while I say this next thing. If we were to go back to the slide on learner-centered teaching, one of the first things that appears there is that there needs to be a significant level of contact and understanding between students and faculty. And this is not something that is easy to achieve with every student, but it is an equity imperative to try to create an understanding so that, for instance, when a student asks for an exception, you have a reasonable ability to judge whether or not you think that student is being honest with you, as long as that's something that you're concerned about in terms of your policy. Yeah, because if we start making exceptions not based on a strong knowledge of the students, then we start getting into territory where we worry about our own biases and assumptions, even ones we're not aware of. Okay. Implicit bias, there you go. That's the word I was looking for, thank you. I know we all work hard to remove those, but all right. So some concrete suggestions, and this is where I might say a few controversial things. But again, none of this is meant to say that if you're using one of these strategies, you're not doing good teaching. These are suggestions from me as ways to improve the equity situation. Well, I'll get into it. So from this background of equity, here are 3 concrete suggestions for you to consider when you're looking over your course materials and policies and thinking about equity, and in particular economic equity. When I say attendance, and there's a citation to the attendance study that I'm going to reference in the little box there. Research on the relationship between assessment of attendance, that is grading it, and attendance itself in terms of students showing up to the classroom is not settled. Because many students struggling with their finances, most especially those living off campus, do not always have reliable transportation and must, because of the position they're in with money, place a priority on work outside of school if they fill into these categories that we're talking about here. Graded attendance can easily place them in an iniquitous bind where they need to choose, for instance, between showing up at work, maybe with a slightly hard-nosed boss or supervisor, and coming to class. Either way, they stand to lose a valuable resource.
For students who are chronically ill.
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Choosing whether or not they're going to take care of themselves.
Right.
Or
do you go through the emotionally exhausting exercise, say a chronic mental illness like depression or social anxiety disorder, right? Do you go through the emotionally and physically exhausting process of getting yourself to class to probably be there late when maybe staying at home and making up the work in a way would be more long-term beneficial, but I'll get there. Attendance policies have a high priority often, and there are good reasons for valuing them. But from an equity perspective, I suggest, in terms of concrete suggestions, that you track but do not grade attendance. This does not mean that students are allowed to miss class whenever they want. They can be held accountable through other strategies. Another way to put it is that I recommend assessing students' learning rather than their presence in the room. Missing classes, and this is just another concrete suggestion, missing classes can be associated with requirements to do other meaningful work designed to compensate for the missing class content, right? This is something that we could absolutely work with you to develop, although I know that there are faculty already doing this. A lot of us responded with great compassion to the online situation in COVID. So moving on, so to doctor's notes. This one affects students living off campus most especially since we have medical resources on campus. Low economic resources often means a lack of health insurance, compounding the aforementioned difficulties with reliable transportation and low influence over work schedules. That is the hard-nosed boss that says, I don't care if you're missing class, you're going to cover this shift or I'm going to fire you, right? Or I don't care if you have to go to the doctor. So asking for doctor's notes is another one of these strategies that, while well-meaning and designed to create equity, if we're talking about a student that doesn't have medical insurance or a reliable ride to the clinic, this can create inequity as well. And there are similar ways around it when we're talking about this, obviously related to attendance, but it's also a deadline thing as well. So do I have a perfect answer for what to do about doctor's notes? No, I don't, but we're happy to generate those ideas and help you implement them. The last one, for purchase publisher resources. Now I know that this is, what I'm talking about here is removing reliance on publisher created resources that go with textbooks and that require students to pay to access or turn in homework and other assignments. Okay, I know that's a big ask. I acknowledge that reducing the use of this content, these very convenient tools, is a big ask, right? However, many students report difficulty understanding the cost structure and timing of payments and difficulty paying for these resources, especially if you're using a mentality of why pay for something when I'm not going to be able to use it 6 months after I've taken this class, right? That can make it even more difficult for students coming from low income backgrounds, since that logic is often really powerful for them. I encountered anecdotal evidence while working on this presentation that many low income and first generation students change majors because of the challenges inherent in these resources. And this came out of conversations with Project Strive Trio. While I've just begun to study this problem from the perspective of advocating for alternatives that are not unduly burdensome for faculty, I would suggest that replicating content that is delivered through these tools, for instance, access to question sets in textbooks within your LMS, those can be replicated within the LMS as far as is possible, right? Doing this, replicating it in the LMS as far as you can is would be a great relief on the part of economically challenged students. Canvas and Sakai both can be set up to do automatic grading, which is something that these publisher tools also do. And TLPEC would welcome the chance to do whatever we can to work with you and support your efforts to remove these from your toolbox and remove these from the resources your students have to pay for without creating havoc for your workflow. Again, we are aware that this is a big ask for faculty, but the rewards for students on the other end are profound, and we are prepared to make whatever efforts we can to assist you in doing this. One of those resources that we would turn to initially would be a set of open access resources. This list was generated by Tish Mindeman, and she's used many of them. You'll see here, right? Each of these is either very low cost or free to instructors and students, and each one that's peer reviewed is clearly marked. So 3 out of these 5 contain only resources, as far as we know, that are peer reviewed. At least they advertise themselves as such. Many of them are through institutions of higher ed. You'll see the openstacks.org set of resources is curated by Rice University, or at least supported and vetted by Rice University staff and faculty. So I will be making the PowerPoint slides available so you can follow these links afterward if you're interested. But again, we are here to help you if you are interested in reducing your usage of these publisher created resources. It doesn't have to be a one and done situation either. We can help you attenuate their use first. Let's see, I had some notes on this, but I winged it. Transitioning away is a big effort for faculty that use them. We're aware of this. We're here to support you. I said that any reduction at all will help low-income students. Moving away from these tools should not be thought of as one and done. I think I said that. It would need time to make it happen in a way that didn't create a really crushing burden for faculty that rely on them, because it does do a lot of very useful stuff. It just has a significant downside for students, especially low-income students. Yeah, Tish.
Going back to the attendance, Dr. Kratz said she had a lot of success in excusing absences when students would meet with her outside of class to cover the content.
Yes.
Regardless of the reason for the absence. It's a big time investment, but it
Yes.
helps her build relationships with students and gets them caught up on the content.
Thank you.
This keeps students who miss a lot of class for like medical reasons, athletics, from falling behind and performing poorly on assessments as a result of their absence.
Yes, thank you very much. That was Dr. Kratt? Thank you very much, Dr. Kratt. That's a really powerful one, especially because of the way, as you mentioned, that it reinforces your relationship with the student. A lot of students assume, and this is something that I was really surprised at, especially when I came to CSE, the number of students who would personally apologize for missing class, as if it was a personal insult to the instructor. I never felt it exactly as that. I'd say missing like half of the entire semester would make me think that you weren't interested in my content, but you know, the fact that students go to such lengths to personally apologize suggests that they recognize it as a wound to their relationship between themselves and their instructors, and meeting in this way would help to repair that, because certainly all of our egos are bruised when someone is not interested in what we're saying. And that is more time, but it could be done during office hours, for instance. Some people have very busy office hours, though. You know, in that case, it would be a sacrifice. But if there's something we can do to help facilitate that through resources like Teams or Zoom, we would be happy to help with that. Anything else awesome in the chat?
Nope.
Just regular stuff? Okay. All right, so I'll come back to the question of attendance at the end with an ask. I'm coming to the end of my presentation now, and I just want to mention a couple of other relevant questions with regards to equity. As I mentioned, I think once or twice, we've been talking primarily about economic equity here, the ability to pay for things that you need to do what you can in college. But this slide shows you a couple of other examples of ways that we can, lenses through which we can look to improve equity in our classes. Our last webinar focused on decolonization. This is a way to address the inequities of history, right? Students not seeing themselves represented on national monuments or money or in textbooks often. These are things that we can somewhat address by changing representation in our classes, you know, taking a concerted effort to improve representation in the materials we use or in the materials we produce. Again, not something that needs to be apocalyptic, right? We don't need a huge break and a restart. I mean, not that it wouldn't be helpful to some students, but we're not talking about demanding that. This can change a little bit at a time. Inequities associated with many social prejudices and power imbalances can also be partially addressed through representation, and also drawing from different knowledge bases, as Tish mentioned in our decolonization webinar. Particularly when we talk about knowledge that we ask students to learn and models of success that we represent in our classes. The reproductive equity mentioned down there is something that I saw a lot, that is always kind of frustrating to have students say that they can't come because they can't get childcare. Well, if we find ways to make accommodations for that on campus in our own teaching, it can be a really strong personal disruption, which I appreciate, but again, allowing a student to bring a child to class, especially once in a while when they can't get childcare, may be something to consider. Even more so, if you are fine with it, consider making that clear to your students, because most of them will assume that they cannot do that. So if you are okay with having a kid in your classroom once in a while, at least once in a while, make sure your students know that. All right, that ask that I mentioned. I would ask if anyone present, virtually or otherwise, would be interested in helping me gather data. I would like to do an IRB study, largely or ideally with lots of different faculty members, on the relationship between grading attendance and actual observed attendance. And this is anecdotal, so it's an attempt to improve my anecdotal belief that there's not a one-to-one relationship between these two things. In the last year and a half of my teaching here at CSE, I dropped the grading of attendance, and I told my students that I was dropping the grading of attendance. I continued to monitor attendance, however, and I didn't see a significant change in the attendance at my classes. Although I did have students gratefully acknowledge the fact that they were more comfortable not coming when they felt that they couldn't do it without an undue burden to themselves. So I'd like to know if that is something that that's representative of our students and of our method. So if you are interested in participating in such a study with appropriate institutional controls to attempt to see what the relationship between grading of attendance and actual attendance at classes is here at CSC, please contact me and let me know. You'll be added to a list of people that will be contacted when I'm able to start working on that process. All right, so we've reached the end, more or less. This is my Works Cited page. It'll be available to everybody in general, I suppose, after the meeting. A couple of really interesting, I mean, I wish I could have done more research, but there's only so much you can do. I certainly did more that didn't make it in. A couple of social support plugs. Our next event will be UDL, that is Universal Design for Learning, specifically focused on representation, delivered by our own Tish Mindeman. March 28th at noon, I think, in one of the rooms around here. There'll be more information coming. I'll also mention that the Graves Lecture Series is tomorrow at 7 p.m. I believe it's in the atrium of the Sandoz Center again. Professor Tawny Tibbetts from the Geoscience program will be presenting on ray guns and the Mayan Empire, and that sounds really cool to me. So if you're around and available, I'm sure she would appreciate the attendance. Okay, that's it. Oh no, okay, no, it's not it. So here's a QR code for feedback.
I'll be emailing that out.
Yeah, we'll send it QR code out. And if there are any questions or things you want to bring up for discussion, we have some time. So I would welcome any questions. I'm happy to navigate back to previous slides if there's something you want to refer to. Yeah.
Joanne is interested in being included in your study.
Thank you. Dr. or Professor Hayes, please if you would just email me and reiterate that, that'll help me remember. All right, so any questions or comments about the content while you're thinking about providing feedback? Has anybody found a particularly good strategy that I didn't mention that you think really balances the equity in your classrooms? I'd love to hear that.